Wait.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first ever episode of our podcast. My name is Chris,
And my name is James.
and we are the Formula One Bros.
Just two twins with a love of F1 to share our thoughts, everything in the world Formula One.
And this week, we'll be discussing everything that you all need to know about Formula One, as well as setting the stage for what is supposed to be an epic 2022 season.
It's going to be exciting.
All right, so before we get into it, I think let's just introduce ourselves and talk about how we got into Formula One, how we started watching it and becoming really good fans, and kind of what led us to this.
Yeah, so I mean, we both have been huge fans since we were very, very little kids. I remember at a very young age when my elementary school teachers, like third grade, would ask me, James, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I would always say, I want to be the next American Formula One world champion. Obviously, that hasn't happened. But
something about go-karts being dangerous.
Yeah. And, I just absolutely fell in love with Formula One. Michael Schumacher is, mine, but also both of ours, childhood hero. He is who I aspired to be. He's who we both aspired to be. And we loved watching Michael race in those Scarlet Speedsters around tracks around the world. And then after Michael retired, I then became a huge fan of the one and only 4-time champ Sebastian Vettel racing for Red Bull. I went full in on the Red Bull train. I was in love.
Yeah, I remember you becoming a huge fan of Sebastian Vettel because my allegiance to Ferrari never wavered. And I remember those years, especially those years that Sebastian Vettel was wiping the floor with everyone.
Yeah.
We were a little bit at odds, especially when we play the old Formula One video games.
Yeah, he would always select the Ferrari drivers. I was always Sebastian.
Yeah, for sure. And I think for both of us, getting kind of into motorsport in general, I think, as Americans, you always start off with NASCAR and IndyCar, especially NASCAR. NASCAR is definitely the biggest thing motorsport wise in America. So I feel like everybody kind of gets started off with NASCAR and IndyCar. And the both of us actually grew up very, very close to the Richmond International Raceway.
Yeah.
So on really clear nights, we could actually hear all of the races, whether it was, the two NASCAR races in the season or at the time, the IndyCar race every July. We could hear the races from our back porch, or from our back deck. And, especially the Indy cars before the 2008 regulations came in and they put mufflers on the engines and they became a little bit quieter. We could hear the loud screams from the IndyCar race and starting in, I think it was probably middle school. We started going to all of the IndyCar races at Richmond.
Yeah. Big IndyCar fans.
Big IndyCar fans. For me, my hero was always Marco Andretti. So, we just kind of grew up in that area. And I remember coming home from school one day. This was probably the Monday after one of the Australian Grand Prix. I can't remember which year it was. It's probably like 2002, 2003, I think.
Somewhere around there.
You came running in the door and was like, there's this thing that we need to watch. It's a really cool racing series. They're in Australia. The best there is Michael Schumacher and he drives a red Ferrari and you got to watch it. And I remember this was back when Formula One was broadcast on Speed in America.
The Speed channel.
And for us as Americans, the Australian Grand Prix is always at like 3:00 in the morning. So it's always super early in the morning. And so they would always rebroadcast it the following day, like 12 hours later. So it was the Monday after the race and we just sat and watched the Australian Grand Prix. And then growing up, I remember watching all kinds of races. I think one that sticks out to me was the 2005 San Marino Grand Prix with the duel between Schumacher and the Ferrari and Alonso and the Renault that would ultimately lead to Alonso's first championship in the Renault. And that has come to be such an iconic race. And, also, we'd always watch the US Grand Prix, in Indianapolis, every year. And so it was just such a huge part of our childhood and what we what we grew up with. It was always racing. And so we've kind of always followed it, but now, with, I think, especially since Liberty Media has kind of taken over Formula One, and a lot of things have kind of gotten produced. We've gone really far down the rabbit hole ever since then. I think probably the 2019 season was when we really, really went down the rabbit hole and really following it, following, everything in the Twitter sphere, YouTube, watching not just the races, but the practice sessions, keeping up with everything in between, all of the storylines, basically up until now.
Watching the timing charts during preseason testing, texting back and forth. Oh my gosh, did you see Ferrari was this such and such time, Mercedes was this such and such time, and it was a good time.
So that's pretty much how we got into it. I just kind of wanted talk a little bit about the content that we're going to be producing on this podcast. So I think, first, it's just kind of everything, from a very unique, I think, perspective and the American perspective of Formula One. I think Americans have a very unique perspective of Formula One just because of everything else that kind of goes on in the world in America and racing with NASCAR and IndyCar, and they being their own separate, entities of racing and having their own feeder series and everything. So really unique.
And up until Drive to Survive, I mean, it was pretty much just NASCAR and IndyCar that was bred into the culture of American motorsport. And then when Drive to Survive happened, you saw this huge wave of interest in Formula One, which is awesome. Looking at the United States Formula One races past year, when it was like they sold the most amount of tickets and had the highest attendance of any Formula One race in history. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah, for sure. So just kind of talking about that and everything, and it's our thoughts and reactions from everything in the world of F1. We'll be keeping you up to date with all of the storylines from preseason and throughout the F1 season, as well as our thoughts, reactions, and everything from every Grand Prix throughout the season. So with that, let's just kind of get started. I know a lot of our audience is probably relatively new to Formula One. I know both of us have had a lot of people reach out, friends of the podcast, saying, we know nothing about F1, but we love to, hear y'all chat about it. So let's just, the first episode, we're just kind of using this as a jumping off point. So if you just kind of let's just get us started about what is this crazy circus that is called F1?
Yeah. So Formula One, at least in America, is most similar to what you see in for example, IndyCar. It's an open wheel racing series, which basically that means, for example, NASCAR, when you look at the car, the wheels are tucked in to the bodywork. They're not exposed by any other than the sidewall of the tires. With Formula One, the tires are completely exposed. The bodywork of the car does not cover the wheels. So that's what it means by open wheel. It's an open wheel series.
No bumpers, no fenders.
Yep. No bumpers, no fenders, anything like that. They look very different than your standard road car. But it's primarily a European sport. But they do race all across the world in 5 continents. We have 23 races in a season. They race North America, South America, Europe, Asia, Australia. And what makes Formula One very unique is it is what is called a Constructor series. Now, what is a Constructor series? Again, I'm going to use NASCAR and IndyCar as examples a lot, but both NASCAR and IndyCar are what are called spec series. Spec series means that every aspect of the car is exactly the same from team to team, car to car. The only thing that is different is the engine manufacturer. For example, in NASCAR, you have Toyota, you have Chevy, you have Ford. You used to have Dodge, not anymore. And in IndyCar, you have Chevy, you have Honda, you used to have Lotus. But the only thing that is different is the engines, the who supplies the engines. And
yeah.
even
and
with that,
we should also say that, especially with IndyCar, it's even more of a spec series because there's only one company that makes the chassis, and that's Dallara. Dallara is the only one that makes chassis for them.
Yes.
So that's the actual body work of the car.
Yeah. So that's what it means to be a spec series. Now, Formula One is what is called a constructor series. Now, what that means is each team builds their cars to a much more broad set of regulations. There are set regulations that the cars have to follow, but it's I wouldn't say it's very broad, but a lot broader than what you say, for example, in NASCAR and IndyCar. There's a lot of room for teams to make different manipulations. For example, if you were to look at the front of all the different teams in Formula One, if you look at the front of the car, every single team has, like, even just the nose of the car is different. The rear wings look different. How the side of the body work is different. All the bits and pieces that are sticking off the car, all of it's different. Even with the halo. So in Formula One, you have a halo. In IndyCar, you have a windscreen. But how the teams like construct the halo aerodynamically looks different for each team. So there's a lot of play in that, and that's what it means to be a constructor series.
And essentially how they regulate that is they have a set of things that are called listed parts. And this is everything in an F1 car that needs to be designed to the exact same specification. And pretty much it's like the floor, the chassis monocoque. So the part of the chassis that the driver actually sits in.
Yeah. And that's for safety.
And that's completely for safety. Structurally, the halo has to be made out of the same materials. It's like military grade titanium that can withstand like thousands of tons of force.
It can, the example that they use is it can hold a double-decker bus, an English double-decker bus.
A London double-decker. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so all of those are listed parts, and then everything else can be developed like freely aerodynamically. So like wings will look different. The side pod shape a little bit will look different. The brake ducts will look different.
And that goes from like pretty much race to race too. They look a little bit different. But there are there's a set of technical regulations that the teams have to follow. F1 cars all have to use what is called a V6 turbo hybrid engine, which the V6, just a fun fact about the V6, because I like geeking out about it. It's the most efficient engine built in the world, which is really, really cool. And the goal,
hybrid engine.
Yeah, it's a hybrid engine. The goal with that, so like 50% runs on petrol and 50% on electricity. And the goal with Formula One by 2030 that they've committed is that Formula One is net zero carbon emissions. So that's kind of what they're going for. But anyway, F1 cars use that V6 turbo hybrid engine, and there are several different manufacturers that make those engines too that the teams use. You have Mercedes engine, Ferrari engine, Renault, and now what is called the Red Bull powertrain engine, which used to be Honda, but Honda is pulling out of Formula One, or pulled out of Formula One after this past season. This past season, the 2021 season, was their last season in Formula One. But Red Bull purchased the blueprints, everything, the mapping, everything to that engine, so that it's effectively now a Red Bull engine that they're making. So they all have to, all those teams, that engine specifically is very, very specific how the teams have to build it and everything, because it has to be the same. But
with that being said, though, there are a lot of like innovations that all of the manufacturers can put through their power units, like how they work, how the pistons work, all of the ignition stuff. They can change the efficiency or the voltage of the battery packs in the MGUK and the MGUH. Those regulate kinetic energy and heat. So they can make changes of all that. They can make the gearboxes more efficient by using different materials and all of those things, but it's the same formula. And real quick, circling back to Constructor versus Spec Series, one thing that I think is also important to know is that with a Constructor Series, they have free development of all the non-listed parts throughout the course of a season. They can develop, like the teams can kind of do their own things, develop their own aerodynamic philosophies. With the Spec Series, there is no development on the cars from any team. All of the teams are exactly the same. And so much so that even in NASCAR, all teams go through a pre and post race inspection, but every week the teams disassemble and rebuild the cars to the exact same specifications. NASCAR is very, very particular about it. Even to the point where I remember there was a race in Dover where Carl Edwards won, but his car was like a centimeter too short and they disqualified him from the race.
Yeah, I remember that.
So there's absolutely no aero development, nothing throughout the season, whereas a Constructor Series, they are.
Yeah. You have free reign to develop however you want those unlisted parts. But continue on talking about Formula One. A lot like, well, not a lot like, but very similarly to NASCAR and to IndyCar, the tires that they use are also slick tires. So meaning there's absolutely no tread on the tires. It's just basically a circle of rubber. There are no treads like on your standard road car, like the car that I drive or the car that you drive. The tires have treads and they have to be maintained to whatever the state standard is wherever you live. At least that's how it is here in the States. With Formula One, IndyCar, NASCAR, they're all slick tires. But what makes Formula One a little bit different from the two is there are several different tire compounds that teams can use throughout the rest of the weekend. IndyCar does that a little bit between like the red stripe soft tires and the regular, I think they're called option and prime tires for IndyCar with Firestone. But also what makes Formula One different is that they race in pretty much any weather condition except snow. But they have wet weather tires. IndyCar does have wet weather tires, but they only race in the rain at road track or at road courses. At a weekend where they're at an oval, if it rains, they're going to wait until the track dries out. In NASCAR, if it rains, the race is postponed. They can't race. But with Formula One, they can race. Only in certain cases have they like canceled or red flag or postponed a race due to weather. For example, back in, I think it was 2019, they postponed the Japanese Grand Prix because of a typhoon.
They postponed qualifying. So it came through.
That's what it was.
It came through. The typhoon came through on a Saturday. And so they did qualifying the morning of the Grand Prix and then they raced that afternoon.
Yeah. And then this past season with Belgium, which was a whole mess.
Rip.
That was a whole mess. They ran 2 laps behind a safety car, just enough to qualify it as a race. And those are the only cases that I can think of that
like Canada 2011. Canada 2011, in the middle of the race, they red flagged it and waited for the storms to pass, things like that.
Yeah. But that's very rare you see that. I think other than Belgium, the last time I saw that was Canada 2011 when they red flagged a race for rain. So that's what makes Formula One a little bit different. I mentioned there are a lot of different tire compounds that you can use. You have soft, medium, and hard tire compounds. The soft tires are indicated. First off, the tires are provided by a company called Pirelli, which is different from IndyCar, which is Firestone, and NASCAR, which is Goodyear. So it's a different tire company, but they use the soft tires are indicated by a red stripe around the sidewall. That's the softest tire. It also, because it's soft, it can go faster, but it burns out a lot quicker. Then you have the medium tire, which is like nice right in the middle. And that's indicated by a yellow sidewall. And then you have the hard tire, which is indicated by a white sidewall. The hard tire is the slowest, but it can last the longest. And then you have the intermediate tire, which is indicated by green. That's one of the wet weather tires. That's for like if the track is a little bit damp but not raining, or it's just starting to sprinkle, and then you have full wet tires that are used when it's, a good rain. I can't remember if they do this, but do they still have like the extreme wets tires that they use? Or is it just the wet tires? Okay.
Nope, it's just those that they use, just the 2 wet weather compounds. And the other thing that I think makes it really interesting is in a dry race. So if there's no rain, you have to use at least 2 different dry compounds in a race. So you either have to use a softer, medium, softer, hard, medium, or hard. You have to use 2 different tire compounds throughout the race. So you're required to at least make 1 pit stop. The other thing also that I just remembered is that with NASCAR and IndyCar, they refuel, but and because the hybrid power units are so efficient in Formula One, you don't refuel throughout the race. You have 100, it's like 100 kilos of fuel that are put in the tank, and then that lasts them throughout the race. There's no refueling in F1.
Yeah. And
which gives you sub 2 second pit stops.
Yeah. Which is ridiculous. When you have Red Bull coming in and the pit stop lasts 1.8 seconds, unreal. And all this stuff makes what Formula One is is referred to as the pinnacle of motorsport. And it's truly, watching a Formula One race it's almost enchanting in a way.
And I will say the TV broadcast does not do justice to how quick those cars go.
Oh no,
it is insane. Not. They did a side-by-side comparison. IndyCar Formula One did a side-by-side comparison for the first year that IndyCar raced at Circuit of the Americas, which is the home of the US Grand Prix for Formula One, and just of like the lap times between the 2 cars. And it was like 30 seconds.
Yeah. It's ridiculous how quick those cars can go. But F1, what's really cool about F1, kind of similar to Indy and NASCAR, but they have several feeder series. They have F2, F3, the W series, and then they have regional F4. So F2 and F3, so going back to spec versus constructor, F2, F3, W series, and regional F4, those are all spec series. So that's what makes those series a little bit different from Formula One, is those are spec series. And the reason they do that is just to make sure that every single driver gets a fair opportunity to make it up to Formula One or to the next series. Yep. So what are, I mentioned what those are, but what actually are they? So F2, that's right under Formula One. So you have F1, then F2.
It's like the minor leagues of baseball. Yeah. It's like the equivalent of like the AAA teams.
Yeah. Yeah. And that is the last stepping stone going into Formula One. That's like the last step. Then before that, you can race in F3, which includes a lot more drivers. I think and we'll talk about this in a sec, but in Formula One, you have 20 drivers. In Formula 3, I think they're up to like over 30. It's very close to NASCAR. And then you also have, I wouldn't say below F3, but you also have another development series, or an F1 stepping stone, is the W series, which is new, which is really cool. It's just women, which is super awesome to see. I think the W series got started in 2019, and it officially became an F1 support series last year. Last year was its first season as a support series, which is so cool to see. There's been a really big push in F1 for diversity as of late, which is awesome to see, because Formula One's been, other than Lewis Hamilton, Formula One's been dominated by white men. So seeing these awesome and really fast women getting an opportunity to come up into F1 is super cool.
And that's innovative across all sports. You have some women that have kind of broken through in other racing series, like especially in America, with Danica Patrick, or in series like in the NASCAR feeder series, with Natalie Decker and Haley Deegan, you have some female breakthrough, but to have just one series that is dedicated for women, for F1 teams to evaluate their telemetry and their progress, like and get themselves a part of development, driver academies, which is another thing that we'll talk about later. Like the 2-time defending champ, Jamie Chadwick, is a part of the Williams driver academy, which is huge.
Yeah. And then right below that, you have regional F4. And F4, that I say regional because each kind of region, like Europe, even specific countries, have their own F4 series. Like America, we have our own F4 series here in America. You have, a couple in South America. I think there's one in Canada. You also have European regional F4, and then you have F4 series in different countries in Asia as well. So that's kind of like your starting point, getting into F4, and then you can make your way into F3, and then eventually F2, and then ultimately Formula One.
Yeah, I think the baseball analogy is really good. Like when a player gets drafted from college or high school, they don't go straight to the major leagues. They start out in single A ball, and the managers from those teams evaluate their performance and kind of get them up the ranks to eventually where they're starting in major league games or playing on major league squads. So it's very similar. I mean, it's a very loose analogy, and that analogy falls apart when in Formula One, you don't send drivers back to F2 to rehabilitate after injuries. But that's where it kind of falls apart. But
yeah. And so you actually mentioned driver academies. I want to talk a little bit about that. So driver academy, the word academy, it's not actually a school you go to. It's basically you signing to a specific team as a developing driver.
And they provide some support monetarily.
Yeah, they provide sponsorship support, all that other kind of stuff. And then you are kind of expected to follow that mold. So there are several driver academies that exist. You have the Mercedes Driver Academy, Red Bull, Ferrari, McLaren, Alpine, and Sauber, which Sauber, that's for the Alfa Romeo team, but it's still the Sauber Driver Academy because that team, Alfa Romeo, used to be the Sauber F1 team. So it's Sauber F1 team, then it was Sauber Alfa Romeo in 2018. Then in 2019, it completely became Alfa Romeo. But it's still, that driver academy still operates as the Sauber Driver Academy. And so developing drivers or younger drivers who want to get to F1, it's really, really good to sign to these driver academies. It's almost like here in college sports, like making a verbal commitment or making a commitment to play college sports at a certain school. Like, for example, a football player, quarterback would, make a commitment to play at, I don't know, Oklahoma. And then they go play at Oklahoma, and then that will get them into the NFL. So that's kind of very similar to how those driver academies work. So speaking of driver academies and teams and whatnot, can you talk about all the different teams and drivers that are on the grid in F1?
Yeah. So Formula One operates a little bit different from other series, especially here in America. So like with IndyCar and NASCAR, the amount of drivers and the amount of cars that those teams run is solely based off of how much money they can put into running cars. So for like Hendrick Motorsports, they have like 4 or 5 drivers. Chip Ganassi in IndyCar usually runs 4 drivers, and they're running a 5th in the Indy 500. Like they have a lot of, and smaller teams like in IndyCar, like Dale Coyne, they'll run 1 or 2 drivers, or like Juncos Racing puts in 1 driver for the Indy 500. And so it's like smaller teams can do less, and they run on much more limited schedules. For Formula One, every team gives 2 cars and contracts 2 drivers. And so that is, I think, good because it provides a little bit of level playing field for all the teams. But it can be a barrier to entry. It costs somewhere upwards egregious amount of like 200 million to even like be considered to be a constructor in Formula One.
Yeah,
so
you got to have money first. Cash is king.
Yeah, of course. So I'm going to go through in 2021 Constructor Championship finishing order. And I'll go teams and then all the drivers. So the teams are Mercedes, Red Bull, Ferrari, McLaren, Alpine, which Alpine is a subsidiary of Renault. Renault, like Alpine is under the parent company of Renault. That team used to be Renault. Now it's Alpine. Aston Martin, Williams, Alfa Romeo Sauber, and Haas F1. So Mercedes is is a German team, but they're based in, their bases are in the UK. And they have Lewis Hamilton and George Russell, both from England, contracted for them. Red Bull is an Austrian team, but again, based in England. And they have contracted Max Verstappen from the Netherlands and Sergio Perez from Mexico. Ferrari is the Italian team, and they have Charles Leclerc from Monaco and Carlos Sainz from Spain contracted to them. McLaren is actually started by Bruce McLaren, and Bruce McLaren was a New Zealander, but it is an English team. And they have contracted Lando Norris from England and Daniel Ricciardo from Australia.
Yeah, and Bruce McLaren actually, he raced his cars that he owned when McLaren first started, which is really, really cool.
Yeah, very rare nowadays. Then you have Alpine, based in France and England. They have different bases, like the Renault engines are manufactured in Paris, but the F1 team is based out of England. And they have Fernando Alonso from Spain and Esteban Ocon from France. Then you have the Scuderia AlphaTauri, which is the Red Bull junior team. It's the only team in Formula One that is considered a junior team of another team. And AlphaTauri is essentially Red Bull's clothing brand. So the team is named AlphaTauri for the Red Bull branding. And they have Pierre Gasly from France and Yuki Tsunoda from Japan contracted for them. Then you have Aston Martin, the works team from England, and they have contracted the 4-time champ Sebastian Vettel and Lance Stroll from Canada. Sebastian Vettel being German.
I love Seb.
Then you have Williams Formula One team. The last, one of the last couple remaining independent teams on the grid. Williams is based in England, and they have Canada's Nicholas Latifi and Thailand/England compatriot Alex Albon. He races under the Thai flag, but has dual citizenship in both England and Thailand, but races under the Thai flag. Then you have the Alfa Romeo team, and that Alfa Romeo is an Italian car company, but it is pretty much essentially I would even say more than a title sponsor from the team. It's essentially run under the Alfa Romeo brand.
Yeah,
but they still operate under the Sauber Corporation and the Sauber Formula One base, which is in Switzerland. And they have contracted Valtteri Bottas from Finland and Guan Yu Zhou, China's first full-time Formula One driver.
Which is really cool to see.
Yes,
we love having
awesome
drivers from different countries that haven't competed before.
For sure. And then you have the only U.S. team based on the grid, and they have bases in the U.S. and in England. And a lot of these teams are based in, their other car manufacturers or teams from other countries, but they have bases in the UK because Formula One is technically a British company. It is a British company. The home race for Formula One is the British Grand Prix in Silverstone. So a lot of those teams have bases in the UK. It also just makes dealing with like the European Union and the money and then the sponsoring and everything makes it way easier for all of the teams to be based in England.
Yes.
So they have contracted Mick Schumacher, the son of Michael Schumacher, 7-time world champ from Germany, and Russia's Nikita Mazepin. So those are all the teams, all of the drivers that are competing in the 2022 World Championship. We'll kind of talk a little bit about in our next episode. We'll kind of talk about how the grid formation came to be, all of the silly season updates and everything.
And I've got some spicy hot takes of how I think next season will go.
Honestly, I don't even know. Sidebar. I don't even know how it's going to go. I literally couldn't tell you.
I don't know. I don't know.
But yeah, so back on track. No pun intended. Let's just kind of want to chat briefly on the championships that are run through the course of a season and the point scale and everything like that.
Yeah, because Formula One is different between NASCAR and IndyCar because you technically have two championships that you compete in.
Yep.
Whereas NASCAR and IndyCar, it's just one.
Yeah. So you have the drivers and constructors championships that are going on at the same time. And the drivers world championship is exactly what it sounds. All of the drivers compete for points, and the person with the most points at the end of the season wins the world championship. And that's kind of how it is. Max Verstappen is the reigning world champion because he won more points than anybody else over the course of the season. Yes. And we'll get into all of that drama from the last race of the 2021 season in our next episode, because there's so much to unpack there. And then the Constructors Championship serves as just each the total points in a given weekend from both drivers totals up to the amount of points that the constructor takes away from each race. For example, just in a hypothetical, if both Red Bull drivers finish 1-2 with Max Verstappen winning and Sergio Perez coming in second place, and Sergio Perez gets the fastest lap of the race, Max Verstappen will receive 25 points. Sergio Perez will receive 18 points plus a bonus point for getting the fastest lap, which will mean their total points from the season adds up to 44. And so that 44 points is how many points that Red Bull will take away from that weekend. And so all of those points are totaled up to be the Constructor Series. And a lot of times, most times, the team that wins the Drivers' Championship also wins the Constructors' Championship. But actually, this past year, Max Verstappen won the World Championship with Red Bull, but Mercedes, over the course with their two drivers, though Lewis Hamilton came in second and Valtteri Bottas came in third in the points, their point totals allowed Mercedes to win their 8th consecutive Constructors' Championship, which is an unprecedented record.
The only other team that has come close to that was Ferrari from 99 to 2008. They won 8, but it was over the course of 10 years.
Well, yeah. So yes. Renault won 2 in there from 05 and 06, and then they won 07, 08. Yeah. So no team has ever come close to that. And I suspect that no other team will for a very, very long time.
Yeah. Probably.
So,
unless Ferrari can get their ducks in a row.
Right. So this magical system of points, I kind of want to explain it before we move on. So points are awarded to the top 10 drivers from each weekend on a sliding scale from 25 points going to first place and 1 point going to 10th place. I'm not going to go through the whole scale of points. It's a sliding scale, 25-1 for the top 10. Obviously, the higher you finish up, the more points you get. The lower you finish, the least points you get. And there is an extra bonus point for whoever has the fastest lap throughout the race. They actually monitor that very regularly throughout the race. And if you finish the race with the fastest lap time, then you will get the fastest. Then you get the fastest lap bonus point. But the key with that bonus point is you have to finish in the top 10. So there's no last ditch effort from a backmarker team just to get 1 point. So you have to finish. So it's a little tactical move there that actually makes the final laps of a race can be very interesting.
Yeah, it can be, because we've seen teams pull tactics like knowing like Valtteri, or like, for example, Mercedes, a couple races, Valtteri wasn't going to finish in the points, or Lewis wasn't going to finish in the points, and they just slapped some slick tires or some soft tires on in the last 3 laps and snagged the fastest lap away, so that from Max or Checo or someone else so that they don't get that extra point, which we've seen a lot of races, the championship can come down to the final point. So that it's very important.
Yeah, for sure. So that's pretty much the championships, the points, all the drivers competing. Sort of the last thing that I'll throw to you is let's talk like a weekend structure, and then we can kind of go over the 2022 schedule, and then we'll kind of get into some 2022 predictions. So I'll throw over if you want to chat about the weekend structure and the schedule.
Yeah. So weekend structure, season calendar, the weekend structure, there's several different, or I guess 2 different ways that a weekend can be structured in Formula One, which the second way for this year, the second way, which I'll talk about in a sec, looks like it may not happen anymore. I don't know if you saw that. I saw, I think it was the WTF1 guy came out and were basically like, hey, the sprint setup for qualifying may actually not happen this year, which we'll talk about that in a second.
Yeah, we can talk about that.
A normal weekend setup. Friday, you have what is called free practice 1 and 2, which free practice means drivers can go out, they can do whatever practice programs they want to run, get any data they can, anything like that. They can pretty much just drive however they need to.
Yeah, it's also called free practice because it doesn't the drivers that are contracted to that team don't always have to drive in those sessions.
Yeah.
Like I know in a lot of FP1 sessions, teams will put academy drivers and development drivers into those cars to evaluate them. Like I know Williams has put in Israel's Roy Nassani in there. Ferrari uses an FP1 session a couple times a year to evaluate some of their drivers.
Yeah.
So that's kind of why it's called free practice.
Yeah. It's not something that the drivers have to partake in. And then Saturday, 2 sessions again on Saturday, but you have free practice, the third practice session, and then you have qualifying, which qualifying is there are 3 different qualifying sessions. So technically it's 4 sessions that day, but how qualifying works, it's broken up into 3 sessions, or Q1, Q2, Q3, Q standing for qualifying. And Q1 is every single driver. And then going on to the next session, they eliminate the bottom 5. So going into Q2, it's the top 15 drivers. Going to Q3 is the top 10 drivers. And if you make it into Q3, the third qualifying session, whatever tire you use to set the fastest lap in Q2, that's the tire you have to start on. You have to start on that specific set of tires. Mm-hmm. Even though you've ran a couple laps in qualifying, you have to start on those tires. If you're out of the top 10 in the bottom half, you can pretty much just start on whatever compound you want. And it doesn't have to be used. You can use brand spanking new tires, which kind of, it doesn't help a whole lot, but it can play into strategy and getting drivers who are not in the top 10. They can play with the strategy a lot more to get them up into the top 10 to get points. So
yeah, it's a big strategic thing, especially in the Pirelli era of F1, where you have all these different compounds. It can be a huge strategic move.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've seen that happen in past championships at tracks like the old layout of the Yas Marina circuit in Abu Dhabi, where that's very historically it's a very difficult track to overtake.
Yeah, or
Monaco. Monaco, we've seen drivers completely withdraw their cars, like Sebastian Vettel completely withdrew his car from the grid so that they can make changes on things to the car, and then was able to pass a lot of drivers going through the race, and then was able to finish on the podium. So you can use a lot of different strategy plays with that, which may or may not be ethically sound sometimes. Now, and then on Sunday, you have the race. Sunday's the big race day. Now, the second layout, which is what we're going to talk about, this is called a sprint layout, and the sprint referring to qualifying. So you still have on Friday, you still have first practice, but instead of running practice 2, you have a separate qualifying session for the sprint race, which the sprint race sets the grid for the race. So you have a qualifying session. It works the same way: Q1, Q2, Q3. Then on Saturday, you have the second free practice session. Then you have the sprint race, which is a quarter length of the race. It's a quarter length of the race. It's anywhere from 13 to 20, 22 laps, depending on the lap length. And the results of the sprint race, that sets the grid for Sunday. So basically, if they do a sprint race, it's like a race and a half, essentially, throughout the weekend. And then again, Sunday is the race.
Yeah. So qualifying sets the grid for the sprint race. The sprint race sets the grid for the race on Sunday.
Yeah. Oh, and as a little incentive, the drivers that finish in the top 3 get points. So driver finishes first, gets 3 extra points. Driver finishes second, gets 2. Driver finishes third, gets 1 point. Yep. But they were planning on adding more sprint race, because last year there were what, 3 sprint races last year. They were planning on doubling that to 6 races. But because of like cost and everything, and teams, there's a cost cap that teams are only allowed to spend so much money throughout a season. And that kind of like greatly inhibits the teams for spending up to the cost cap, because it basically costs extra money with running the cars
and parts if you get in a crash.
Yeah. So now the sprint race for this upcoming season may not even happen. That's it's rumored. It hasn't been decided yet. But it may not happen, which is
and essentially where this is coming from is teams and like Formula One and the governing body, the FIA, are essentially in disagreement with how much money these teams are allocated for compensation for running extra equipment and everything, and commercial rights agreements for televising these races. They're essentially how much they are just kind of at odds with how these teams will be financially compensated, how much money and how much money they have to put in to make it work. And essentially, they're not changing the amount. They were not planning on changing the amount from last year to this year, the FIA, the amount of money. And the teams are kind of like, hang on, we're running twice as many sprint races and
we need more
we're doing
money.
this twice as many times. We need help, because this is the first, starting in 2020, essentially Formula One now has a cost cap for each of the teams to limit the amount. Very good thing, financial sustainability, everything. But it's the first time that we're doing this. And it was to kind of save like the financial impact from essentially not really having a full season in 2020 because of the COVID-19 pandemic. So they put that in, and it is a permanent fixture now in Formula One. And I want to chat before we start talking about 2022. I kind of want to chat. That's going to be in my little spiel about what I think is going to happen in 2022. So we'll chat about that later. But now, and this is a story that we're going to be following all throughout the off season, and we'll probably do a little bit more in-depth detail in our next episode. But will sprint races happen? I don't know. Stay tuned to find out.
I'm very indifferent about this. It was cool. It was cool to see, but I don't know. I'm very indifferent about that. If they happen, great. If not, it doesn't matter to me.
My personal opinion on the sprint races is I think they're a little gimmicky.
I think so too.
That's
kind of what's off-putting to me about it.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the teams are also in agreement that like the person who starts on pole should be the fastest person over one lap, how it's traditionally always been. Yeah. And I think, and now we should know that the feeder series in F2 and F3, they also do sprint races, and they do it in a way where the top 8 and I'm using F2 as an example, the top 8 drivers in Formula 2 from the feature race go into the sprint race, and they reverse the top 8. So if you win the feature race, you start 8th in the sprint race. And that is essentially to test the drivers to showcase their overtaking abilities. Like if you truly are the fastest in the feature race, let's see how you do put behind a couple drivers, and let's see how you overtake. So that's essentially, it's a way to test those drivers and to evaluate them with a little bit more in depth, which is why for me, if you are Formula One, it's the pinnacle of motorsport. To me, it seems a little gimmicky, and it is great for the entertainment of the sport. It is fantastic, but it is the only racing series that does something similar to that, except for Daytona, NASCAR series does the duels at Daytona.
Yeah.
That is the only other example that I can think of that does something like that. I mean, IndyCar has the IndyCar Grand Prix that runs during the month of May, but they don't have that. That has no bearing. It's a championship race and it has no bearing on the Indy 500. It's a completely separate entity. So that's why I think it's a little gimmicky to me, but F1, the people that are calling the shots make, they're getting paid the big bucks. So it's obviously, if this is something that they decide to continue to go with this, it is truly an entertaining thing.
Yeah.
And like we saw, like in the Brazilian Grand Prix, in the 2021 Brazilian Grand Prix, is I think Lewis Hamilton's best drive ever. He got disqualified from qualifying, started the sprint race dead last, finished 5th, was penalized another 5 grid places because of his rear wing was not in accordance with the regulations from Parc Fermé inspection. And he had to start the race in 11th. And he went from 11th to win the race in a very dominant fashion. And he was 100% the fastest driver that entire weekend. So it is very entertaining. Like, it is an incredible spectacle.
Yeah, as much as that weekend killed me to watch, because I mean, this season I was on the Max train. I was rooting for Max, but watching that, while I was like heartbroken that happened, but watching that, I was like, oh my God.
And to me, that solidified Lewis Hamilton's status as the greatest of all time. Like, you can't, it's just insane. Anyway,
I don't know. you know my thoughts about the greatest of all time. Obviously, I think it's Schumacher, but anyway. So that's kind of the race structure, the structure for a weekend, but the calendar, there are 23 of those weekends. It goes from first races in mid to late March. I think it's late March. And it goes all the way.
It's the second weekend in March.
Yeah, and it goes all the way to December, and there are 23 races. So what are those 23 races? We start off the season in Bahrain, in the Middle East. And we continue on after Bahrain in the Middle East to Saudi Arabia in Jeddah. Then go across the entire globe to Australia. Then we go to Italy in Imola for the Emilia-Romagna Formula One race, which used to be the San Marino Grand Prix. It used to be nicknamed the San Marino Grand Prix. It's still at that same track, but it's just named something different. Then we go to the United States, Miami, Florida, which I'll talk about all the different tracks and things like that. And then we go, after United States, we go to Spain. Then after Spain, we go to Monaco. After Monaco, we go to Baku, Azerbaijan. Then we go to Canada, then Great Britain, England, and then Austria, then France, then Hungary, then Belgium, then the Netherlands, Zandvoort, which was a new track that we saw last year, which was exciting. Then we go to the Italian Grand Prix in Monza. Then we go to Russia, Singapore, Japan, then the second United States Grand Prix in Austin, Texas, which you and I will be going to. Very excited about. We're going to that one. So we're going to make a ton of content about that weekend, which is very, very exciting.
I'm so excited. I'm so excited.
Then we continue on our Western Hemisphere trek to Mexico and Brazil. And then we go all the way back where the season started to the Middle East in Abu Dhabi. Now, some races may be affected by COVID-19. We're still in a pandemic. It's still going on. And some of these races may be affected. Like the
reason why they're going to be affected is because they have to ship all of this stuff all over the globe. And there are thousands of people, like personnel, that have to go to all of these races. And so it really depends on each individual country's immigration policies throughout the COVID pandemic.
Yeah, and we've seen some countries, like, for example, Australia, who's been in the news recently with the Australian Open with tennis. They have a very, very strict COVID-19 protocol, which was why in 2020 and 2021, the Australian Formula One race didn't happen because the Australian government didn't allow the teams to enter the country. So hopefully we can have Australia back on the calendar. I love that track, even though it's racing at 3 a.m. for us over here. But I love that
making
track.
It faster.
Yeah, they are making it faster. They updated gave it a little facelift. So I hope that can happen. And a couple other races were not on the calendar last year. A couple other races. Canada wasn't on the calendar last year. Singapore was removed, and Japan all were removed as well because of COVID-19. So hopefully we can race at those places again, because all of those tracks are awesome.
And as unfortunate as it is, because I think the city street circuits are some of the most entertaining races. Those are the ones that are hardest to put on in the pandemic, because you have to, the city has to shut down essentially, and you have to build the track, and that
for a month
happens months ahead of time. So that's why with like Singapore, and then in 2020, the Monaco Grand Prix was canceled, because you can't have these tracks on like a temporary, like postponed to a later date. Like all of the city courses, like street courses, were canceled in 2020 because you can't move those dates because you have to shut down the city. And so I'm excited for the Singapore Grand Prix to come back, because
I'm too. It's a
great track. It's a great facility. The original night race for Formula One.
The first one. It was awesome. Yeah. And we do have one of the tracks that I listed is brand new, never been raced before. The one in Miami, which is super cool. They're building a track around Hard Rock Stadium, which is, I'm very curious to how the logistics of that and operating Hard Rock Stadium where the Miami Dolphins play, because they're essentially building that track where all of the parking lots were. Like, they're just building it over the parking lots. So I don't know where the parking for that stadium will be or anything like that, but they're building the track around, and it looks like a really cool setup. They've already been working very, very diligently building it. They just put in the first set of grandstands there, which is really cool. So that'll be cool to see.
I imagine they'll still have the parking, like paint on the track, but it'll just be,
No.
So
it's a permanent track that they're building. It is a permanent track, not one that they'll lay down and then pick back up after it's a permanent racetrack.
Interesting. Yeah. So
I've seen some of like the paving of it on Instagram, and they completely took it, and all the other dead space that's not racetrack, it looks like it's like hospitality areas, like grassy lawns, all that kind of stuff, that it's part of the racetrack facility.
Which is interesting, because I cannot imagine the logistic nightmare that's going to cause for the city of Miami.
And for the Miami Dolphins to play football.
Oh my God, I know. Yeah. Yeah. And all of those fans that are going to be going to those games. Well, not only the Miami Dolphins, but the University of Miami plays college football there.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
So all those football fans that are now going to have even further away to park. I imagine that the parking that they set up for the Grand Prix, I imagine, will also be used for football games. Like I would imagine, if they were smart, that they would be doing it, killing two birds with one stone, using the same parking. But we're also not privy to that information, so we'll find out when it comes.
Yeah. So, going on to the last little bit, let's set the stage for this upcoming season.
Yeah.
Let's set the stage. So, one of the do you want to start off, and then
I'll start off, because I just kind of want to talk briefly. So there's a lot of hype around the 2022 season that this is going to be closer racing than ever. Many more teams vying for the championship. There's a lot of hype around it, and there are a couple things that I want to talk about. We are getting brand new cars in 2022.
This is I think it's the biggest regulation change in Formula One history from one season to the next.
So the whole idea about these new regulations, technical regulations for the cars, essentially they're completely redoing what the cars are going to look like for 2022. The whole philosophy is to make the cars more raceable. So just a brief overview: when a car is cutting through the air, they produce a lot of wake off of the back of the rear wing. That's called dirty air. So it's air that has been disturbed by the racing car. And that changes the aerodynamic characteristics of the cars greatly, how they handle, how much downforce that they can produce, all of that stuff. And the current regulation of cars are designed, they're very wide. They have very complex aerodynamically. They're designed to go fast. They're the fastest cars in Formula One history, but you can't really follow. Like it takes really like bad. Almost like over 50% of the downforce off of the front of the car when you're following at close range. Like it's a huge amount.
At some tracks, you need like upwards of over a second advantage on the car in front to even come close to being able to overtake, or you're just going to be stuck behind them.
Yeah. Like before, like Abu Dhabi, before that they reconfigured the track, it was like you needed a 1.5 seconds pace advantage of the car in front of you to be able to overtake. Like that's insane.
It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous.
So the way that they're doing that is they're making the aerodynamics on the car much simpler. Like the front wing is going to be one single piece. The rear wing is going to be one single piece. They're outlawing barge boards, which are essentially the aerodynamic bits in front of the side pods that kind of direct airflow around the car and off the back of the car. And the big one is they're bringing back ground effect. Well, ground effect was a thing that was pioneered in the 80s, where they would put skirts on the sides of the car to create Venturi tunnels. And essentially the Venturi tunnels, what they would do is they would channel airflow to create like negative pressure that would literally suck the cars to the ground and help them go really, really fast around tight corners. And this was before safety, like health and safety was like a huge thing for Formula One. And so a lot of people wrecked, got injured, were killed in that era. So they outlawed ground effect. But now it's coming back in a much, much more controlled way. So they're creating Venturi tunnels on the side of the car, and everything aerodynamically is much simpler. The halo is going to be much more integrated into the monocoque, everything. And it's essentially to help the wake off of the back of the car be much cleaner, and you're relying a lot more on the underside of the car to create downforce, and then the overside, like the top of the car. And just to give you an idea for those that don't know, theoretically, Formula One cars create so much downforce, the force that the air going over the car pushes down on the car into the track, so much so that at full speed, a Formula One car could drive upside down and not fall down. Like they could stay sucked to the track. Obviously it doesn't do that. There's a lot of other physics that goes involved, and why that is entirely out of the realm of possibility, but that's how much downforce that those cars produce. And now the downforce is coming a lot more from the underside of the car than the top of the car. So other than that, but I think, and so the idea of those regulations are going to be much, much, much more like, it's going to make everything a lot more, the car's a lot more racy. But other than that, there are actually a couple things that the guys at the race F1 were talking about. Some things that I kind of want to cover is I don't think it's just going to be brand new cars that'll kind of shake up the running order. The regulation change, there are a lot of other regulation changes that are coming in that we will finally see the repercussions of from when it was changed for the 2020 like COVID pandemic. So the cost cap, like the spending cap for the teams, every team is only allowed to spend 145 million in operational,
which I want to point out, which sounds like a lot of money, but before this cost cap, you had teams like the big three: Ferrari, Red Bull, McLaren, and Mercedes. McLaren was kind of included in that too. That would spend upwards of, $700 million. And then you have teams like Williams who are only able to spend $50 million. So that's like one of the main reasons that they introduced those cost caps. So that way you don't have teams like Ferrari, which didn't do a whole lot with their $700 million in 2020 and 2021, let's be honest. But you don't have teams that are spending an egregious amount of money and then teams that are spending, in comparison, a dime.
Yeah. So the cost cap regulation is going to create a much more even playing field. And in addition to that, there's now, so every team previously would have a limit to the amount of aerodynamic running that they can do, but it was all based on how much money that you can throw into running a wind tunnel. Yeah. So now they've introduced a sliding scale of aerodynamic testing, how much time you can spend in a wind tunnel testing. And the sliding scale goes in reverse order of Constructors Championship. So the further you finish in the down in the order you finish in the Constructors Championship, you get more aerodynamic testing time. So for example, if you win the Constructors Championship, you get 90% of the allotted time in the wind tunnel, which is so many hours over the course of a season or hours throughout the week. And then if you finish 10th or last in the Constructor Series, you get 115% of the amounted aero time. So there's a reverse sliding scale that allows the underachieving teams to test more and puts a limit on the testing for the teams at the front, like Mercedes, Red Bull. So that, and we will finally see the first time where that will really affect the development of the cars throughout the season.
Yeah.
So,
and that'll be cool too, because that would cause the teams towards the back to be able to do more development, and the teams at the front, like Mercedes, Red Bull, maybe even Ferrari, they won't have as much development throughout the season. So the season could potentially start like this, and then just the gaps could close, which it would be really, really cool. Because normally you see the gap, it start, and then by the end, the gaps is just massive because you have all that crazy spending.
So outside of all of that and outside of all of this money, a lot of teams have been investing in the culture and the efficiency of their operations. Like Ferrari, McLaren, Alpine, Aston Martin are completely overhauling their personnel structures and everything. You're seeing this, and we'll cover this a little bit more in detail on our first episode when we talk about there's a team principal restructuring happening right now. But all of these teams are really putting a lot of investment into
different type of silly
changes.
Season.
What?
I said different type of silly season.
Yeah, for real. And they're putting a lot of emphasis. And the reason why teams like Red Bull and Mercedes have been so successful, like Red Bull over the past 12 years, Red Bull and Mercedes have been the only ones to share in the Constructors Championship glory. And that's because they have the personnel structure in place. They have the culture in place. There's no political interference in anything that they do. And that has been seen, especially for teams like Alpine, McLaren, Ferrari, like that is what has been holding them back. Obviously, you have to build a fast car, but a lot of teams are putting investment into that. And the other thing we have to remember, there's a historical precedence here. Most times we see a major regulations overhaul, the pecking order restructures.
Yep.
Excuse me. So for example, we saw from 2008 to 2009, there's a whole regulation change, and the early 2000s were dominated by McLaren and Ferrari.
Yeah.
Those were the two teams, from basically 2007 or really, 2000 onward, it was McLaren and Ferrari. You had Renault sprinkled in there some.
Yeah, which was almost kind of like just random. But anyway.
Yeah, so lots of regulation overhauls, and, they completely overhauled the regulations, and McLaren and Ferrari didn't nail the regulation changes. They slipped back a lot. Big time. That allowed Braun GP to kind of come in and steal the spoils from all of the investment that Honda had made into their 2009 program. Honda pulled out because of the financial crisis. Ross Braun bought the team for £1 and created this monster team that eventually would become Mercedes. Yeah. And then, it was Braun GP. And then at the end of the 2011 or 2009 season, Red Bull was winning everything. It was only because of the work that Jenson Button and Rubens Barrichello did in the first couple races that allowed them to get the championship, both the drivers for Jenson Button and the Constructors Championship.
Because he won the first 6 races out of 7. He won 6 races out of 7.
Yep. And then the whole second half, like the rest of that era, which is called the blown diffuser era, was dominated by Red Bull. 2010, 11, 12, and 13, completely dominated by Red Bull. And then 2014 came in, completely changed the cars, the way they look, and put in new engine regulations. And that's when the V6 turbo hybrids came in. They were V8s before. The V6 turbo hybrids came in, and then Mercedes, that began the run of Mercedes dominance from 2014 to now.
Yep.
And so that's been a huge
8 years in a row.
Red Bull, and Red Bull has never really been able to recover from 2014.
Yeah.
So, and also there's been a lot of personnel changes, like, Red Bull bringing Adrian Newey back to design their cars. And so
I'll talk about that here in a sec.
Yeah. So there's a lot going on behind the scenes that's not just the brand new cars. There's so much investment going into the culture, the people, and there's a historical precedence here that and we've never seen anything like this. Like even in 2009, you still had the same contenders that were there, so it's going to be incredible.
Yeah, which is why I really think this upcoming season, 2022, is going to be a lot like the 2012 season. Now, the 2012 season was unreal for a lot of reasons. And there's kind of like a lot of hype around this season comparing it to the 2012 season because it's a decade later. So why was the 2012 season? I'll talk about that real quick. Why was the 2012 season absolutely crazy? That was my favorite seson to watch in recent history. Was 2012.
You can't beat the 2012 season.
So it started off in Australia. Everyone thought, because McLaren qualified. Jenson Button, Lewis Hamilton qualified 1-2 for Australia, and they finished 1-2. Everyone was like, well, McLaren's going to run away with it again. Well, not again, but they're going to run away with it. But the first 7 races, there were 7 different winners. 7 different winners. We didn't get the first repeat winner until race 8, which was Fernando Alonso. And by that point, the season was almost halfway over. There were 20 races that season, and that was race 8. We had our first repeat winner in Valencia.
Yeah, and to put that into context, that rarely happens.
Yeah.
Like that in a constructor series, that just doesn't happen.
Yeah, like and think about like last year, you just had the title fight between, it was basically always just going to be Lewis and Max. Mm-hmm. And then in 2020, it was just Lewis and Valtteri. No one could compete with Mercedes.
And in 2019, the first 8 races were won by a Mercedes driver.
Yeah, and most of those
either Lewis or Valtteri.
And some of those, I want to say like half of those were just Mercedes 1-2.
Yeah, it wasn't until Austria when Max Verstappen won in 2019 that we had our first non-Mercedes winner on that season.
Yeah. And then in 2017 and 18, you kind of had a little competition. Well, a lot of competition between Mercedes and Ferrari with Sebastian, but it was always just Sebastian Vettel and Lewis Hamilton. And then in 2016, 15 and 14, it was all Mercedes. It was no one could compete with Mercedes. So from 2014 until this past year, it was all Mercedes. No one could compete. Ferrari competed a little bit in 2017 and 18, but they did it kind of by cheating. Which that's a whole other rabbit hole.
Different saga.
But anyway, and then before that, it was all Red Bull. But the 2012 season stands out. And so 7 different winners in the first 7 races. I think, and that set the stage. By the end of the season, you had 4 or 5 drivers up until 2 races before the end. You had 5 drivers that were mathematically able to win the championship. You had Sebastian Vettel, Mark Webber, Lewis Hamilton, Fernando Alonso, and Jenson Button, with 3 races left that were all mathematically able to win the championship.
And that's across 3 teams, and those seven different winners across those first 7 races. What is it? You had McLaren, Ferrari, Mercedes, Red Bull, Williams. Mm-hmm. So 5 teams that won those opening 7 races. Yeah.
So and what's really cool, the reason I'm comparing this to 2022, let's look at Red Bull specifically. So in the era that Red Bull was completely dominating, 10, 11, 12, and 13. All of those cars were completely designed by a guy named Adrian Newey. 2022, this is the first time since 2013 that their car is going to be designed completely by Adrian Newey. Okay. So I think Red Bull is going to be very, very competitive this year, just like they were in 2012. And another reason why I think it's going to be very similar, because you have Ferrari has been really hyping up their engine. They had a lot of lost speed in 2020. Their engine just couldn't compete with any other engine on the grid in 2020. Last year, they kind of got some of that back, but there's been a lot of hype around how well Ferrari could do. And honestly, I think Mercedes, now it depends on who their driver lineup is, because there's still a big question mark over Lewis, which that I could talk an entire episode just by myself talking about that.
And we'll talk about that a lot next week.
Yeah. So Mercedes driver lineup could play as to whether or not they could win. In my opinion, I think it'll come down to their driver lineup. But anyway, and then you have McLaren, who looks like they're going to be really strong next year. So you have 4 teams right there who could be really, really strong next year.
And a lot of teams underneath that are making strides to be up there, like Aston Martin and Alpine.
Yeah. I really think that there could be 4 or 5 drivers that could compete for a title, and 3 or 4 teams that could compete for a constructor title. Like, I think the big 3, Ferrari, Mercedes, and Red Bull, will still be the top 3. I have no idea how they're going to finish, though, which, very similar to 2012, it wasn't until the very last race in Brazil when Red Bull won the constructors. But
and the drivers' championship.
And the drivers' championship. Yeah. So there's a lot of really, really cool hype about that. Now, I mentioned that there were 7 different winners from 7 different races. So race 1 was in Australia, and that winner was McLaren's Jenson Button, which he qualified on pole. He dominated. I'm pretty sure he was first in every single practice session, qualifying, and the race, which was it wasn't only just a grand slam of a race, it was a grand slam of a weekend for him. And then in race 2 in Malaysia, you had randomly Fernando Alonso, which
in a
Ferrari
very
looked like they were going to be just absolutely dreadful in 2012. They looked like they were going to be horribly dreadful in 2012.
And
they were for a good amount of time. But Fernando Alonso was leading the championship for the entire second half of the season. He was leading the championship.
Yeah, Fernando's just magical.
Yeah. And then in the third race in China, you had Mercedes I think it was their first win with Nico Rosberg. Race 4, we go to Bahrain, and this was Sebastian and Red Bull's first win of the season, which the year before, 2011, was completely dominated by Red Bull. I'm pretty sure it was very similar to the 2020 season for Red Bull, or for the 2020 season for Mercedes in 2012 or 2011 for Red Bull. It was pretty much a Red Bull driver winning every race.
Yep. Leagues ahead of.
Yeah, no one can compete. But in 2012, their first win didn't come until Bahrain with Sebastian Vettel. Race 5 in Spain was also extremely random. Pastor Maldonado from Williams won the race in Spain,
which is his first and only F1 victory.
Yeah, and that was Williams' last victory in Formula One. That was Williams' last victory in Formula One. And it was very, very random. And Pastor, he was a pay driver. He was there because he had a lot of sponsorship money. Wasn't necessarily because, he was good, but he was there because he brought money to the team. That's pretty much why he was there. That's what a pay driver is. And he won a race. Eddie Jordan said it best. Pay drivers that can win in Formula One, hats off to him. And then we get to Monaco, race 6, and that was dominated by Mark Webber, Red Bull. And then Canada, the other McLaren driver, Lewis Hamilton. And then we go to Valencia, and that was the first repeat winner with Fernando Alonso. I wholeheartedly believe that this next season, this 2022 season, could be very, very similar to the 2012 season. I really think that I can see right now, I can see 5 teams competing for a championship.
Yeah.
I can see 5 teams.
And watch, a couple teams absolutely nail the new regulations and absolutely everybody else is just absolutely nowhere, and we're completely dumbfounded, and there's like 2 teams that can only compete.
I know.
And
I say that, and it's still going to be like 2 teams, like Mercedes and Red Bull, or Mercedes and Ferrari, or Ferrari and Red Bull. So I could see, and I could see 5 drivers competing for the title too. I mean, obviously, if Lewis Hamilton comes back, I can see Lewis. Obviously, Lewis is going to be in the picture.
Which I think Lewis will. I think
so too. George Russell, he's shown that he, in a Mercedes, he can. I mean, in 2020, when his one race there, granted, he finished 6th, but that was not his fault. He was leading that race up until Mercedes made that tire mistake. Yeah, it wasn't even close. Like, he
even
passed
after they made
Bottas.
The pit stop mistake, he had clawed himself back up to 2nd, and then he had a puncture.
Yeah, so I think George can be in the mix. I think Charles and Carlos could be in the mix with Ferrari if Ferrari lives up to the hype, which there's a lot of hype around Ferrari.
Charles just has to stop crashing on the first lap of races.
I know. He's got to stop crashing. Most of that's not necessarily his fault, but he's got to stop crashing. But we've seen in a woefully underpowered and disadvantaged car, for example, in Silverstone, he was leading most of that race after Max. He led most of the race after Max was taken out. It was all Charles, and then Lewis came back and overtook him with like 3 laps to go, I think. But I mean, I think Charles could do it. I think Carlos could do it too. Carlos was, I think, the driver of the year this past season.
Yeah, for sure.
Obviously, Max, new champion. I think he could be thrown into the picture too. I really do. And I'm still unsure about Checo, but
I think with Sergio, I think it's going to come down to improving his qualifying performance. If he can, because the problem that he had last year was he wouldn't qualify well, and that left him with a lot of work to do in the race. And by the time he cleared all of the drivers in front of him, he was already a pit stop cycle behind Max Verstappen or Lewis Hamilton. He was already so far off the pace that he essentially didn't influence the results of the race at all. So it's really going to come down to, and he's never been a strong qualifier. And I think that is what has actually boosted his reputation when he was racing for Force India and Racing Point, is he wouldn't qualify well, but he wrung the neck out of that car and he put it in positions where it should not be. Like that team, and he was definitely punching above his weight. So if he can get his qualifying thing under his belt, then for sure he will have a shot at a title.
Yeah. So to basically recap and bring it all together, I think Mercedes will be competitors. I think Red Bull, Ferrari, and McLaren. Maybe one other team. I think it'll be close. There's a lot of hype surrounding randomly Alpine coming into this season. My
money is between Alpine and Aston Martin. My money's on Alpine.
Yeah. And then, you could see both Ferrari drivers, both Mercedes drivers, and Max Verstappen all competing for a title next year. I really think that could happen. Now, the only thing I'll say is I think Lewis will come back, but if he doesn't, I think that drops Mercedes, in my opinion.
And honestly,
no matter who they hire, I think that'll drop Mercedes.
Yeah.
Because I think, let's be real. Let's be totally honest. Since Nico Rosberg left, Mercedes was all Lewis Hamilton.
Yep. For sure.
Valtteri never stood a chance. So,
quick on his day, but not consistent enough to take it to Lewis for a championship.
Yeah. So that's kind of why I think 2022 is going to be like 2012.
Yeah. For sure. And I think another thing that we have to kind of keep in mind is, so in 2021, this past year, Formula One brought a physical car that was built under the 2022 regulations. And they did this whole unveiling, like this ceremonial unveiling of the new regulations. And when they put this car out on the grid with all of the drivers around it, a lot of the team principals and a lot of the people that are heads of aerodynamics and chassis and like technical development of teams said, hang on a minute, our car looks nothing like that. So we truly have no clue what is going to happen. And Mattia Binotto, the team principal of Ferrari, said that Mercedes and Alpine had found something in the regulations that nobody else had found. And meanwhile, Ferrari is making all these gains on their power unit. And
they've gained almost 100 horsepower back.
Yeah, they've recovered, so much horsepower from the lack of power starting in 2020 and like all of these things. And I truly have no idea. And I think there have been a lot of people, drivers, team principals, that have come out and said, like, no clue. We have no idea.
Yeah.
From what I understand from drivers that have been in the simulator, like Nico Rosberg has been in a lot. Lando Norris has been in it a lot.
I think Charles too. Charles.
Yeah. They've all said that it's definitely much more difficult to drive. You have to, and Lando Norris even said that you kind of have to wrestle the car a little bit more, kind of almost like an F2 car. You have to wrestle it a little bit more to get it to do what you want it to. It's not like the, the 2020, the 2021 cars where
it was effortless.
You turn the car, it goes where you want it to go, So I think it's going to, I truly have no idea. And I think I think the only thing that we can do to make predictions is going to be based off of expected progress and the strength of your driver lineups.
Yeah.
I think that's really the only thing that we can go off of.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that is for our next episode.
Yep. That's for our next episode.
So thank you all for tuning in. Everything about F1 and setting the stage for the 2022 season. We will have plenty more content coming your way throughout the off season.
Oh yes.
And in preparation for our the F1 season. What's up?
Yeah. So we're going to be throughout the season and with what we are doing, releasing content and stuff. We have an Instagram, which I'll put up here in the banner. We have an Instagram. We also have a YouTube channel, which is where we're going to be releasing our stuff, as well as on Spotify. So I'll put up our Instagram so you can see it. You can follow us on Instagram. There we go. And boom, you can follow us on Instagram at Formula1Bros _bros. And we're releasing all this stuff on the Anchor app, which will go on to Spotify, YouTube as well. Potentially TikTok, maybe. We'll see how releasing our stuff on YouTube and everything on Instagram, all that stuff goes. And during the when we're not recording and releasing content, I'll be sharing stuff to the Instagram story. Like I've been doing that a couple of times with cars announcing when they're gonna unveil their new cars, tracks getting facelifts, all that kind of stuff. Any news that could be happening, I'll post on the Instagram story there. Any pictures and all that kind of stuff, and see how that goes. And then we could potentially put our stuff on TikTok. Who knows? Yeah.
So stay tuned. We'll be back with everything you need to know in the preseason roundup, getting ready ahead of the 2022 season. And then we will be releasing podcasts every time there's a Formula One race with our thoughts, reactions, and covering all of the storylines throughout the season. So thank you all for joining and stay tuned.
Yep. Hold on to your butts. It's going to be a fun season. All right. Bye, everyone.